everyone to feel like they have ample time to discuss and ask questions if they feel. So I want this to be informal. I'll keep checking the chat throughout. Oh, I didn't start recording yet. I'm going to record right now. Oh, Stephen, we are recording, aren't we? Okay, great. That's why Stephen is the IT guy and I'm the nature person. Okay, so let's get started. If you have questions, put them in the chat and we can upgrade you to a panelist later if we would like to verbalize and talk to each other. So welcome today. It's a beautiful sunny morning. It's cold, but it's sunny, which is great. Oops. Oh, there we go. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about myself and kind of how I got here and, you know, what my experience is with invasive species. And this picture pretty much sums up everything you need to know about me. I'm very passionate about being outdoors in the environment and just everything. And it kind of sums up, you know, the wonder and awe I get every day when I'm interacting with nature and I'm outdoors. So that is actually a Cecropia moth larva, which I'd never seen in the wild before, which is why I'm so geeked and excited. And a very cool native species that you really don't get to see that often. So my journey really started at MSU. I went for zoology and I ended up switching to fisheries and wildlife, which, you know, I had no idea you could even major in something that cool. And so in fisheries and wildlife, that's the first time I actually learned about invasive species. Nowadays, it's so great because elementary kids, middle school, high schoolers, they're learning about invasive species now, which is just so great for me to see in my career that that information is becoming available earlier and earlier. And I didn't even, you know, realize anything about invasives till college. I actually worked at the MSU Student Organic Farm for 5 years while I went to school, which was really a cool experience because, you know, as you know, organic, you don't use any pesticide. And then one of my first jobs in my last year of schooling, I was an assistant at an invasive species management company that specialized in aquatic invasive species management. And that's a lot of chemical control and integrated pest management. So I really got the flip side of chemical, not chemical benefits, pros and cons, all that great stuff. So after that I got thrown into invasive species management and I've been doing it for almost a decade now and doing volunteer coordination. So that's my journey. Okay, so before we get started with, you know, invasive species, we're going to talk about them so much, you know, I kind of call it almost like a curse once you know what they are because you see them everywhere. But first, let's talk about what a native species is. So a native species occurs naturally in the area that it originated. And so therefore it has, there's a balance there. It has natural predators. It's evolved with all the other species and organisms around it since the beginning of its existence. So I love this picture. I was going to fill this slide with all these native species. I have lots of pictures, but I just really loved this one because it's this beautiful calico pennant dragonfly on snake grass. Well, I call it snake grass. It's called a lot of things. And they both evolved 300 million years ago. And so they've been around each other for 300 million years. So you can imagine once you bring in another species that hasn't co-evolved with that other species for as long, it can really mess things up. And when it does it in a big way. And that's when it becomes an invasive species. Now we have non-native species here that they do just fine. You know, they can coexist. They're not native, and you know we'll talk about why that's important. But they don't take over, and that's fine. You know, a hosta is non-native, but it's it's not an invasive species. So native species are important just because of that adaptation. Some species are so evolved around each other that if they don't have, their other host or a species that they get food, shelter, reproduction, something to help them complete their life cycle. If they don't have that species, they can completely die out. And we've seen that happen in the past. So, that's why we hear all this native gardening is super important, because all of our species here are adapted to each other. So our native species are very important. All right, so let's really get into what an invasive species is. So this definition is from the state of Michigan, but it's really the same everywhere. An invasive species is a non-native, like we just talked about, that actually causes harm. So it causes economic harm, it causes environmental harm, it can be dangerous to human health. In my neck of the woods, I really deal with, the environmental harm, but it's also very economic. Here we have pictured the invasive Asian carp, which most people at this point have heard about Asian carp. In Michigan, it's a huge deal. We're very lucky in Michigan to have our Great Lakes. They're a very valuable natural resource. And so Asian carp is very scary for us. They're a non-native fish that is just crazy, as you can see from this picture, and they can really take over and displace native fish species. And so Michigan has $1 billion billion fishing industry. So if you think about economic harm that those Asian carp are causing, they're displacing that $300 billion or whatever industry that we have in Michigan. And in the same token, we're spending millions to billions of dollars actually managing these species. I get paid to manage invasive species. We have a budget to manage them every year. So it does cost us economically. Invasive species do not have to just be plants. We are going to focus on plants today because that's what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. This webinar today is really to give everyone a perspective of what, if you were to go out on the trail today, what would you encounter? So we're going to really focus on something that's localized here. But they can be an insect, plants, mammals, fish, and it's different everywhere you go. North America is not the only place that deals with invasive species. They're everywhere. So we all have our own problems. We kind of get stuck in this bubble, but we all have problems. And so if you see this article about Japanese knotweed, so Japanese knotweed is huge, a huge deal in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of laws against it. You can't, buy or sell property that has knotweed on it because it can destroy foundations. And we're going to talk about knotweed and how crazy it is. And so it's a little bit different everywhere, but we all deal with it. So an invasive is a non-native that causes a lot of harm and it gets out of control. All right, let me know if you have questions at all throughout this. And please take a break, stretch, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. Don't worry, this is being recorded. And like I said, it's very informal. Okay, so we know what an invasive species is. Now, where does it come from? How does this happen? Why does it keep happening? So a lot of our shrubby species, like privet, multiflora rose, those were introduced, some of them a really long time ago, like the 1800s. And so we kind of think, well, why haven't they become naturalized at this point? Why haven't they become a normal part of our environment? And it's exactly what we just talked about, because they can't become a normal part of our environment without causing issues. So a lot of them were planted and brought over because, somebody wanted to have this crazy garden that had as many species from around the world as possible. And so that's how some of them started. You know, some of them get started because, and it's why a lot of them spread, you know, they're sold in local nurseries. There's seed packets shipped everywhere. Something that was really big in the news this year is people were receiving these weird, strange seeds. And it's really cool nowadays, though, that we do have that awareness where they put out all these alerts, don't plant this, don't plant this. But for a long time, you know, you get seeds, you plant them, and you see what happens. Some of them were also introduced, unfortunately, for habitat use. They were introduced for soil stabilization, natural hedges, wildlife habitat. The privet pictured here is, people use it as a natural hedge because as you look at it, it makes a great fence. But you know, then it gets out of control. Some of our other invasive species, such as our insects, that we really have to think about, they come in shipping material. Aquatic invasive species can survive in ballast water. Also within our state, aquatic invasive species are difficult because they get stuck to propellers on boats and they can last out of the water, you know, for several weeks, and they get put right back into water and they just go right back to life and and keep living their life, which is, you know, something that that is actually an admirable trait, is these are why these things survive, because they're very, very hardy. You know, in Florida, they have a whole different slew of invasive species, like venomous snakes and boa constrictors, things that we don't really have to think about. But those invasive species came about because people were releasing pets they didn't want. And, you know, now there's a network called Ripple, which is all about, you know, not releasing animals or pets into the wild. And so there's really a large buildup of why all of these organisms are here. It's not their fault. They were put here, they were brought here, and they're just doing what they know how to do. And the biggest reason why we have invasive species that are out of control is because of lack of education, lack of awareness. So the first step is just educating yourself. And then now that they're here, we have issues because a lot of them are planted. Japanese barberry is still widely planted basically at every Wendy's I've ever been to. They're just used for landscaping widely because they're hardy and they grow well. Recreational use, so, you know, that's why keep your dog on a leash. They can pick up seeds. A lot of plants are adapted to entice animals and people and to stick to them. So they can carry them around. You can get them stuck in you can get seeds stuck in your boots, and then you go from one natural area to another and you track them around. Birds really love to spread invasive seeds because, I mean, look at those berries. They're beautiful and red and they look delicious. So, you know, we run into that problem of them being spread through excrement. Okay. So I was trying to think of a good way to, I'm a visual learner. So how can we visually see what an invasive species is? So I kind of took a bunch of different pictures I have of spring ephemerals. And spring ephemerals are temporary wildflowers that we get in the spring that are just my favorite part of life. And I'm really looking forward to spring every year because of them. And they're very vulnerable. You know, a lot of them are very low growing. Some of them, their seeds are spread by ants. So they might just have a colony, you know, across a hillside, and all those seeds have been spread by ants and planted by ants. So they can be slow growing, and they're just not as hardy. You know, you can step on one and kill it. So I kind of put all those together in one picture of, imagine walking into you know, a beech maple forest, which is where a lot of these pictures are from two different places, but all these species can occur together in a really great environment. And it's really awesome when they do. So we've got bloodroot, we've got the trillium, which is the big, beautiful white flower with 3 petals. We've got Jack in the Pulpit, Hepatica, Dutchman's breeches, squirrel corn. The really pretty purple flowers are a native pawpaw. I have a pawpaw grove right across the road from me in the natural area I live next to. And so these can all occur together, and they can occur just like you're seeing them on the screen, where they can be really interspersed. They don't really push each other around. They can all grow together really well because, once again, they've all evolved together. And this is what a healthy beech maple forest looks like in the spring. This is what the understory will look like. It will just be filled with these beautiful flowers. In the springtime, if we're going into, maybe a beech maple forest that's disturbed, it's had a lot of disturbance, it has a lot of traffic, maybe one garlic mustard seed got in there. And if it doesn't have all this diversity that we see right here, see, that's why diversity is important, because it makes our ecosystems, it makes these habitats really resilient to invaders like invasive species. So they could, they could persist through that. But if you have an already kind of unhealthy habitat, you might see something like this when you walk into the woods. And so this is just, to me, this just says it all. So this is garlic mustard, which is one of the species we're going to go over. And it can just create this dense monoculture. So monoculture is when just one thing grows. So think of a field of corn, only corn grows there. So, we see this in the springtime. We see garlic mustard and Dame's rocket. And if you look, down at the bottom of the screen, how are those little spring ephemerals that are maybe only this tall, how are they going to grow through that? They grow at the same time in the year. A lot of these plants do. So how are they going to get through that? How are they going to get sunlight? How are they going to compete against that? So that's in essence what an invasive species looks like visually as a picture. All right, so now we're going to talk about habits. So when I say habits, when I walk on the trail, a lot of times I can just see invasive species, way off on the trail just because of the way that they happen. So like we talked about, and like we saw in that picture with all the different flowers, we saw a lot of diversity. We saw a lot of different species. But like when you look at this picture at the bottom of the screen in the middle, you just can't see much going on other than that vine. Now there is grapevine included in there too, which we'll talk about grapevine. It's actually not a invasive species. It's a native vine in Michigan, but we'll kind of talk about why it gets a little out of control sometimes. So yeah, when we look at this picture, if you're seeing that, you're probably looking at an invasive species. Native species just don't occur at that level of taking over. We do have, that's Oriental bittersweet, and we do have a native counterpart, which is called American bittersweet. And American bittersweet is never going to do that. And if it does, something's going on, just like with grapevine. It's a native species, but when we have an imbalance in, let's say, this forest right here, if we don't have a lot of good diversity, if it's not being taken care of, if it's exposed to a lot of sunlight, let's say it's like this forest that I took a picture of is bordering a cemetery. So it's a line where it turns into lawn, and then all the sun comes down in there. And so that's when great native species like grapevine can kind of take over, because they can be aggressive. And if there's an imbalance, they can get out of control. So when we're thinking about invasive species, we want to look at, is there a lot of them? Does it look like a monoculture? Another thing that we want to look for is, let's say we're walking out in the woods in November or December, which I actually took the picture in the top right corner. The green leaves in the snow, that was taken in late November, almost December. So when you're seeing green leaves and green growth, when everything else has fallen or everything else has died back, that's a really good indicator of an invasive species. And one of the reasons that they are so successful, because when plants get their energy and their food source from the sun, and they go through photosynthesis, and green is the byproduct of that too. And so when you're seeing that green, the first sun that starts to come out in the spring, those plants are going to be taking that in first. So they're accelerating their growth rate because they're staying green all through the winter. And once they start getting that warmer spring sun, longer days, they're just going to take off, and they're going to start growing before the native species do. So it can really outcompete other species because of, persistent green leaves, and, when it's covering everything as well. I have a picture of a deer here because, as we know in Meridian Township, I run the deer management program, so I know very well. We can have a lot of damaging effects from our deer herd. If you go up in the UP, I couldn't say with confidence that they have less of a deer problem than we do here, because we don't have wolves, we don't have bears, we don't have the natural predators that might disperse those deer or keep their numbers down. Now, why I'm bringing the deer up is because they really like our native plants. Things like Trillium are like candy to deer. And so they help this imbalance get worse, because they'll come into an area and they will browse on our native plants, which most of the time there's not that many of, and they don't touch the invasive species usually. Or maybe they're picking up berries, or maybe they're tracking seeds as they walk through a grove of privet, and then they're also eating native species. So they can kind of help perpetuate the problem. It's not, once again, it's not their fault. They're just doing what they know what to do. It does happen. One of the other things that invasive species are capable of doing is they can have allelopathic tendencies, which simply means that they can release a chemical into the soil that inhibits the growth of other organisms, other plants. So I put a picture, it's kind of hard to show a picture of an allelopathic situation, but pine needles can have that effect too. When they fall on the ground, they can acidify the soil. So that's why a lot of time when we look, into a pine forest, we don't see a ton of growth in the understory. And when we do, it can be a native species that's adapted to that acidity level. But once again, invasive species are really tough. So, we can have invasive species coming into the understory of a pine forest, even though the soil is more acidic. So some of our invasive species like garlic mustard and Dame's rocket, some of the honeysuckle, they can have allelopathic tendencies. So they actually make the soil less habitable for other species. So all these things combined just make for this powerhouse, really, that kind of just steamrolls everything else. Okay, so before we get into identification, and please let me know if you need clearance on, clarification on anything, or if I'm going too fast. I'm trying not to ramble. This is kind of my jam. So we're just going to talk about some plant identification basics. So things that we're going to go through when we talk about each invasive species is leaf arrangement, leaf characteristics, flower characteristics, what kind of fruit they produce, how they reproduce. So fruit and reproduction really go hand in hand. So we kind of lump those together. But the most important thing to think about when, let's say you come out to one of our work days and I'm doing my best to explain to you, because for me, I just see it, why is it a honeysuckle? Well, because it is, because that's the way it is. That's the way it looks. No, but there's real ways to distinguish these plants. And so you really want to take their characteristic that sticks out the most. And that's what you want to go off of, because there's a lot of plants that look very similar. And so you really want to focus on that distinguishable characteristic. Okay, so we're going to talk really quick about leaf arrangement. So these, and I just really like these drawings because they're simple and you can really get a feel for it. Sometimes when you're looking at a plant, it can be difficult to see this, but so we have opposite leaves. So opposite leaves grow out directly across from each other on a stem. Alternate, a leaf comes out, then we go up the stem and another leaf comes out. So they are not directly across from each other. Can alternate and opposite look very similar sometimes? Yes. So we call that sub-opposite. When the alternate leaves are really close to each other, but they're not quite there, that's sub-opposite, but they're still alternate. And so sometimes you just have to look really close. So the other, basil, a basil rosette is something that we're going to see when we talk about Dame's Rocket and garlic mustard. So I'm going to kind of hold off a little until we can see a nice picture of that. But it's basically just a circular arrangement of leaves that comes out right at the base of the plant. So we'll see a really good picture of that. We're not going to talk about any species that have a whorled leaf arrangement, but that's basically when the leaf kind of cups the stem and they all kind of go around and cup the stem. So it just how it sounds. It has a whorled shape to it. So I have a picture. It was a little bit tricky. But I don't know if somebody wants to put in the chat really quick what leaf arrangement you think this plant pictured here has. Okay, let's see, we got somebody. Yes, so it is opposite. So the reason I say it was maybe a little tricky is because when you look at the top of the branch, oops, going the wrong way. Oh no, I don't know how to go back. Okay, previous. Once again, I'm not a computer person. So when you look at the top of the stem, it almost looks like that one leaf is popping out a little bit below the other one. But if you look at the two leaf axils at the bottom and then at the very top, you can see that they do come out straight across from each other. So that is opposite. Good job, Susan. Okay. Now we're going to talk about leaf characteristics. So once again, we have these really nice, just drawn pictures. So a leaf can be a lot of shapes, but when we talk about leaf characteristics, we're focusing on the margin of the leaf. So the margin is just the outline of the leaf. So we've got a couple examples here. Just a second, this thing is in my way. So we've got toothed, which is just like what you think it would be, which the edges are toothed. Sometimes they're really sharp tooths. Sometimes they look almost a little more rounded. We'll see that with garlic mustard. So it's just the edges they're toothed, and sometimes they can be big and sometimes they can be really tiny and they almost look like they're not toothed, but they are. So you got to look really close sometimes. The picture above the toothed is what we call entire. So when it has entire leaf margins, it just means that it's smooth. So pretty easy. We've got our lobed and sinuses, our lobes and our sinuses. And so pictured in that drawing, you can see that looks like a white oak leaf. And so we can all kind of envision an oak leaf in our head, and it's got all the little dips. And so the picture I have here is of spotted knapweed. And you can see that the leaf has a lot of lobes and sinuses. And again, these all can vary. And it's important to remember that just like humans, plant traits can vary widely. So that can make identification hard too, because it is the same, but it might look different. Okay. All right, so we've got flower characteristics. So there's regular versus irregular. When we look at, we've got two regular that are kitty corner from each other. And regular means that if you took the flower and you drew a line down the middle, it would have radial symmetry. So it would look the same on both sides. Irregular is the two pictured, which I guess I just forgot to label them. Sorry about that. But you can just, they're just kind of in a regular shape. They don't have that radial symmetry to them. Now we have a totally different, which we have one invasive species, I think just one that we're talking about today, that has a compound flower, and that's flowers in the aster family. And when you look at that dandelion head is not just one. We don't consider that just one flower. It's made up of tiny, numerous flowers, which is kind of cool. Even though, and it has radial symmetry, right? But it's compound because it's made up of lots of little tiny, tiny flowers. Okay, sorry, I'm going a little slow between slides. I'm just making sure there's nothing in the chat. Okay, so Michigan has a lot of invasives that we're going to see commonly. And like I said, this is a conglomeration of what I see in the field. We have a lot of really great organizations that do invasive species education, but they all have priority species, like Phragmites and Japanese knotweed and black swallowwort. Those are very common, but they are not generally what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. What I deal with on a day-to-day basis is these horticultural escapes, shrubby type of things. So this is kind of where I got this idea for this webinar. Is I want something that when you walk on the trail, you're like, oh, that's what that is. I see that every day. So that's what we're going to be going over. And all the information about identification is from MISN, which is the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. And it's a great, great resource. It has these awesome training modules. And so outside of my own personal experience, that's where my identification knowledge is coming from on the presentation today. And pictured here, we can see more of that Oriental bittersweet. It's just, whew. All right, so our first guest on the show today is garlic mustard. And so I've got herbaceous species right above that. We're going to go through a few herbaceous species. So herbaceous just means that it's lacking a woody stem. So it completely dies back to the ground every year, or maybe not every year, it might be perennial. So an annual dies back, it completes its entire life cycle in 1 year. A perennial does not, it keeps coming back. We'll talk about a biennial right now. But yeah, herbaceous just means that it lacks a woody stem. It doesn't store anything, trees they still are alive, they're just storing that energy for the winter, but these die back. So garlic mustard. This is probably one that you're already familiar with. It's kind of the poster child of invasive species. which I think it's because, you know, we can hand pull it. We can get kids out in the woods and they can fill up tons of trash bags of it. It's an easy invasive species to educate on, and it's also edible. So it can be kind of a fun, you know, a lot of people do pizza party garlic pulls. And one of the big, you know, things about garlic mustard that's always fun too is it actually does smell like garlic. When you rub the leaves between your fingers, it's just very garlicky. If you're at a pull, there's the smell of garlic in the air. And it is in the mustard family. So we have a lot of pictures here, but something I really want to touch on is that it's biennial. So its first year of growth, it's got that basal rosette that I kind of talked about earlier. So it's got this little circle of leaves that pop out the very first year. And so you can see the pictures, the two pictures at the top there, that one's a close-up, and the other one is kind of what it might look like, you know, if you're walking on a trail. So that's the first year growth. You can pull the first year growth. Some people do choose to, if it's like really dense and there's a lot of it, they might, you know, chemically control it. The basal growth is not what we generally pull all the time. We really go in and get the picture that's right below the basal rosette where they're taller, they're easier to pull at that point. But the unfortunate thing is once they're at that stage, they're producing seeds. So in this first year, it is nice. They're not producing seed yet. It can be great to control them at that stage. As we can see from the leaves, they're toothed, but you know, like I said, those first year tooth margins look a little rounded. They're not quite as spiky as the second year growth. And so when we look at the bottom there at the second year growth, we can see it has these nice flowers. It has alternate leaf arrangement too. Almost forgot to mention that. And you can see that in the picture. But it's got these little tiny white flower clusters at the very top of the stem. And because it's mustards all have 4 petals, and it's going to be a regular flower, so it's got radial symmetry. And this is why some people really like garlic mustard, because it can be really pretty. And so they also see it in the woods a lot of the time and they think, oh, cool, that's a pretty flower. Oh, we've got something in the chat. Are they allelopathic in the first year? From Elizabeth. That is a really good question. And I don't know if I can say 100%, which is, you know, that's something too. I want to preface. I'm not going to know everything, but I will 100% look that up and research it. I believe they are. I know that garlic mustard is one of the invasive species that they really study for allelopathic tendencies. So I'm guessing they are, but I don't want to say yes for sure on that. That's a really great question. Okay. All right, so for reproduction, we've got these seed pods. And so this is going to happen. So the flowers kind of come out. We'll see garlic mustard. Actually, that picture of the basal rosette is taken, I want to say, end of March, early April. So it can really be looking strong. I mean, it can look like that right now if you walk in the woods. Again, one of those things that makes it a formidable competitor. It stays green all year. But yeah, so it's gonna look like that early spring, and it's gonna start really popping up and flowering in May, big time. May is like the big flowering time for that. It can flower out early, a little bit earlier too. So we're gonna start seeing these seed pods come in after the flowers. So they start arriving really intensely, probably like mid-June, end of June into July. Now, a lot of people stop pulling them once the flowers go away because the seed pods, they obviously they have the seeds in them. So people kind of think, well, I'm not really going to pull them if they've got the seed pods on them. I don't want to spread it. But the thing is these pods do take a while. They'll start to harden over time. And as they harden and dry out, then if you hit a plant, the seeds, you can hear them hit the leaves that go pss and like spread everywhere. But up until then though, we've got a question or a chat. GM is allelopathic. Yes. So it is definitely allelopathic. So I'm assuming that the basal rosettes are going to be as well. But definitely a good question because it also makes us think, what is the potency? Because when they're that young, they're really focusing, on their growth. So maybe the allelopathic tendency is less in its first year. Definitely something interesting to think about. Thank you, Zabby. Yeah, so as I was saying, if you can pull them with the seed pods, but it's good. Like I usually cut off pulling them at the end of June. If you can tell that the seed pod is still intact, go ahead and pull it and then bag it up. We're going to talk about management tools and techniques at the end more so, but if anything produces seeds like this and it's an invasive and you're removing it, do not just pile it back where it is because it's going to love that actually. So make sure you bag it up and you throw it out. It's kind of weird to throw plants out, but you have to with this one. So yeah, with that, and that finger-like quality is characteristic of mustards. And so I hate seeing this when I walk into the woods in midsummer and you can just see all those little fingers sticking up. All right, so that's really garlic mustard in a nutshell. We're gonna move on to our next. Oh yeah, and even though this past year we, in March, our garlic mustard season got blown out of the water by COVID. But we did have some volunteers who were still going out on their own time safely. We weren't in contact with anyone, and we still got like 300 pounds out of Nancy Moore Park, which is just great. So it's a great, easy invasive to remove in the spring. Okay, this one is always fun because it's kind of controversial, in my opinion, because people love Dame's Rocket. I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful plant. It really is. And it can just, when there's fields of it, it's just like one of those magical things where you're like, oh my gosh, there's all these gorgeous plants growing here. But it is just terrible. It's right on par with garlic mustard in how aggressive it is. It's also allelopathic. So you can imagine that like that. So this picture at the bottom was taken off of the inner urban trail right on that bridge, right when you come out of Nancy Moore Park. And you can imagine if that's there for years, what that starts to do to the soil. And it just keeps making the soil better for itself. Now, funny enough, right next to that, right when you pop out of that trail, there's this really bizarre big patch of trilliums too. So I was kind of worried seeing this because I'd really like those trilliums to stay there. But once again, when we look at that Dame's Rocket and how tall it is, trillium is not going to last under that. It does grow it grows in the understory of forest, but it can also grow out in full sun, just like you see here. But that is the threat it poses to spring ephemerals, is it can grow in the forest understory. So it, just like garlic mustard, it's a biennial. And so the first year it has a basal rosette, as you can see pictured. And that picture was also taken at the same time as the garlic mustard basal rosette. So about end of March. But I mean, look at how strong it looks. That's a really big advantage right there. It's got nice big leaves out to soak up some sun. It also has toothed leaves, but its leaves are lance shaped. And they're also like a little fuzzy. They've got some tiny little hairs on there. They're alternate as well. I think for me, what gives them away in the woods is that basal, well, as far as the first year growth, is that basal rosette. It's just, you don't see other, there's not other species that you're going to see that green early on. I mean, we have native asters that have nice big leaves, kind of like that, and they come out in a cluster, but you're just not going to see them that big and green at that time of the year. So that's a really good time. These are actually really easy to pull. The garlic mustard is really small, but the Dame's Rocket can be pretty large in that first year growth. And so I love pulling it even this time of year. If the ground is loose enough, which in some areas where it's wet, it is, and you can just pull it and bag it. And you really don't have to bag the first year. I just don't take chances. And I also like to record the poundage. So, but when we look at the flowers and the flower arrangement, this is why people plant it widely. And it's got purple to white to lavenderish colored flowers, and they cluster at the top, similar to garlic mustard, but these flowers are quite a bit bigger. The garlic mustard is very small, and just like a mustard, it has 4 petals. And you can see too in that picture, it's a good illustration of when they're not bloomed as opposed to when they're bloomed. So you'll start seeing those flower heads around the same time in May again, but I always feel like they come out just a little bit later than garlic mustard, and they persist through the summer. I can't believe I forgot to put a picture of the seed pods here. But just like the garlic mustard, after the flowers have run their course, they form the seed pods. And they start forming them in July. And once again, you can keep picking them as long as they're intact and they're still fresh. I didn't mention this about garlic mustard, but a single plant of Dame's Rocket can produce up to 20,000 seeds. And garlic mustard is generally around the same average, maybe just a little less. On average, garlic mustard is like 7,000 per plant. And that just blows my mind. That's insane. And so if you look at that field of them right there, you just have to imagine that's crazy. That's so many seeds. So really the biggest problem with this invasive species is how pretty it is. I got an email the other day asking, they got a seed packet in the mail. So that's one thing. Please, 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 please check your seed packets. Even if it says pollinator mix on it, I don't care. Check that seed packet, because it might be a pollinator mix for California, which is great. That's fine. But it's not native here. And a lot of times they can have Chinese forget-me-not. They will have Dame's Rocket. And so her question was, why, if this is an invasive, why did I get it in the mail? And so what's wrong with planting it? It's so beautiful. Well, you can't trust that. Even bee organizations and nature organizations, I get seed packets all the time that I just can't plant. So just, there's this beautiful plant right here is a native phlox. So it's called wild blue phlox. It's a really great counterpart to Dame's Rocket. We have a number of native phloxes like this, but they're not very common. This is probably our most common one in this area. But there's local native nurseries that cultivate these species, and they are so beautiful. The thing is, they definitely are not as easy to grow as Dame's Rocket and garlic mustard. So that's where a lot of people, they just want to kind of take the more convenient way, which I totally understand. I completely get that. But if you have a chance to nurture some of these other species, this is actually strictly a forest species. So I took this picture at Waldemar Nature Center. Oh, I didn't take this picture. This isn't my picture of wild phlox, but I do have a picture of wild phlox in Waldemar in their beech maple forest. And so, I don't know what difference can you see in this species when you're looking at maybe the leaves or the flower arrangement. Yeah, so it has, Elizabeth said it has 5 petals. So I just want to make you aware of that because if you are out in the woods and you are pulling garlic mustard, just make sure you're really looking closely. The flowers taper. Yep, they're not full Chanel. And also the leaves are opposite, it looks like, and they're much narrower lance shape. So just keep in mind that there are, even though we're talking about how crazy invasive species are, there are a lot of native species that we might accidentally overlook. And so just keep your eye out when you're in the woods. I'm trying to acquire some of this for my shadier garden this year. Okay. So now we're on to spotted knapweed, which, so the 2 species, garlic mustard and James rocket, that we looked at, they can grow in open areas, but they can also grow in forested areas. This herbaceous species is going to be mostly found in open prairie, like kind of drier sites, upland, prairie, grassland. So on the west side, they have a really big issue with this in their dune systems, like some of their dune prairies, because these, like I said, they can really handle drier sites. And okay, we've got a couple questions here. Okay. All right, I already got that one. Okay. Oh, allelopathic spelling. Here, let me type it in really quick. Oops. Yeah, any resources that you think of after this, and if you'd like anything from me, you can always email me. So should knapweed be bagged as well? Yes. So knapweed it's actually difficult to bag too. It can really rip up your bags depending on what time of the year you're pulling it. So just like the garlic mustard, I didn't have the picture in the middle at the bottom is a picture of the basil rosette, the first growth of the spotted knapweed. And as you can see in that picture too, the soil just looks really dry. So like I said, it's more prone to drier sites. But the other picture that I'm holding the leaf in my hand, that's also that's going to be a second year growth, but it can be kind of tricky. And with this species, I honestly really like going for the first year growth because it's much easier to bag, but those seeds, once again, are a huge issue. So when you see these beautiful purple flowers, some people can kind of get them confused when they're in these prairie areas. They kind of might think they look almost like an aster, or maybe they look like monarda or bee balm. But if you look closely, they have these little, and also thistle. Thistle is the other one that people really mistake this for, but they don't have spines like a thistle. And they have these little leafy bracts that are dark on the edges and kind of furry. And so for me, that's the distinctive characteristic that I look at with these. I mean, the leaves are very distinctive too. They've got those lobes and sinuses, and they can really vary from that, the one that I'm holding in my hand. But those bracts are just they're just a good tool because, like I said, the leaves can really vary. If you're looking at the picture at the bottom right corner, and I don't know if it's the same as for you, but you can see that those seed heads, those bracts, the flowers are gone, but that's where they keep all the seeds. And at that point in the year when they're all dried out, and if you hit that plant, you can hear the seeds go whoosh, and like they get like flung. So they can produce a lot of seeds as well. So they definitely will need to be bagged. The difference with this flower is that it is compound. So all of those, tiny little petals that make up the entire flower head. I'm trying to think, oh, there's a question, just a sec. Would it be better to cut it rather than pull? So we're going to talk about different management strategies. Something like knapweed, if it's in its first year, if you're able to mow at a height that's still good for the other plants, like, so this picture is taken at our Davis Foster Preserve, and luckily this knapweed is only in the front near the trailhead, which is another habit of invasive species. So when you go to a park or a preserve, you'll notice that a lot of the invasive species occur right at the trailhead, or they occur right at the trail sides. And once again, that's because we are tracking it in from somewhere. So I noticed this was starting to creep along the edge into that trailhead at Davis Foster. And I pulled it as much as I could out this year. But we might burn that prairie. Or we could potentially, because we have the equipment, we have the staff, we could mow this area down continually and high enough for, you know, other native grasses or native species to be able to persist, but maybe it would keep the knapweed back. But the best way to control this right here, because it was a very small population, is to just pull it and bag it. So that's what I would suggest. Okay, we've got one more question. How tall are some of these plants when they flowers? Photos have no height, reference. Okay, so garlic mustard and Dame's rocket probably get anywhere from a foot to 2.5 feet tall. Once they get the pods, they can be more like waist height, like, you know, closer to 3 feet at the very tip. Knapweed is quite a bit taller. It can get taller. So it might get up to 3.5 feet tall, just total with all of the flowers and everything, which is why it's also really great to get it when it's in its first year, because that can be hard to bag. Okay. All right, so, oops, and that is a mistake that I was supposed to fix last night and I forgot to. Japanese knotweed is not a woody species. This is an herbaceous species. It does look like it's woody, but it is not. It actually dies back every year to the ground. Sorry, I'm moving my video here. Okay, so this is a very interesting species. It's insanely aggressive. I don't have a height reference for this one either, but it can get, I mean, when I took 10 feet off of mizzen, but I've seen it grow taller than 10 feet. And the thing about Japanese knotweed is it grows out more than anything. So it can just really take, because it will just keep coming up as rhizomes. So Japanese knotweed, introduced from Asia. Like I said, it's been a really big issue in the United Kingdom. When it does die back, it leaves these big, so if you see that picture with the circle, so those, they almost look like bamboo. A lot of people liken them to bamboo. They turn brown and they stay sticking straight up in the ground. So they almost look like dried up bamboo stalks when they die back, which is why some people think they're a woody species. But if you look closely, they have a streaking along the stem. It's like a purplish, pinkish, reddish. And they also have this, it's called an ochreous. And wherever the leaves are coming out on the stem, there's this kind of sheath around called an ochreous. And that is specific to the knotweeds and smartweeds. Smartweed is probably something you've seen in your garden a lot, and it's always hard to pull and it always comes back. So knotweed is one of these really aggressive species that people do often pull when it first comes up. It's got alternate leaves. You can see from the picture that has the blue sky in the background, that's a really good picture of how just the shape of the leaves, they're almost like a heart shape, but the base is flat, and they can be, 6 inches long, so about the size of your hand. Now there's other species of Japanese knotweed, like there's hybrids, giant knapweed, um, which I didn't include in here because I have a lot of species that I'm going through, but the giant knotweed is much bigger. Like the leaves are much, much bigger, but they have a very similar shape. And I'm going to give you resources to look at Mizzen, and they have training modules on all these, and you can go crazy with that. But yeah, so that's kind of what I always notice, is that they almost look like a zigzag, the way the leaves come out. And the new growth, I'll show you on the next slide, but let's talk about the flowers really quickly. The flowers come out quite late in the season, so I would say late July, August, and a lot of times they come straight up off of the leaf axils. So the leaf axils are just where the leaf sprouts out from the stem. So they will pop up right off of those leaf axils, and they're just these little tiny flowers. And sometimes they kind of droop through the season. The leaf margins are entire, they're not toothed. And I want to show you the next picture because we're going to talk about how it reproduces. So the seeds aren't really an issue with this, the reproduction of this invasive species. A lot of people even say that the seeds don't do anything, or I guess there's, cultivars or varieties that the seed doesn't produce anything. But really the way that this plant reproduces is by rhizomes. So if you look at that picture at the top, those new shoots, this is what this is what people pull a lot because they think it's some weird small weed and they don't realize that it's attached to a much larger plant, or maybe it's the beginning of Japanese knotweed. So Japanese knotweed can send out rhizomes 20 feet away from its parent plant. And I think I've seen even more than that as well. And it can also fragment. So if you mow it and pieces get chopped up, those little pieces can begin to also grow root hairs, and then those can root. So the problem with this species is it started really occurring along roads and streams, and people just kept mowing it to control it, and the mowing was actually spreading it. Apparently every time I went to this great presentation on Japanese knotweed, when it is injured, it sends out another rhizome. So it's a very reactive plant. If you don't manage it correctly, it can easily get much worse and out of control. So you can see this other picture where it's actually growing up through asphalt, and it can grow through concrete. That's why the United Kingdom, like I was saying, it's illegal to buy and sell in some areas when there's an infestation, because it can go through foundation. It's just a very destructive plant. As you can see in this sign says Japanese knotweed contaminated area, don't disturb. Because like I said, it's very reactive. It can make the problem worse. That looks almost like a soil pile back there. And so the UK does have a lot more strict rules with Japanese knotweed, but in the US, which I was kind of going through something with the property behind my house with this, it is illegal to move any soil with Japanese knotweed in it, which is also really hard to know because of all the little tiny fragments and roots So if there is digging or moving of soil close to a stand that you can see, that's actually illegal. And, you know, you can file a nuisance lawsuit, I think. And, but that's just the seriousness of it. I went to Cleveland recently to, I think earlier this year, or no, later this year. And there were just hillsides covered with Japanese knotweed. So it can really get out of control. And we are going to talk more about how to control it, but mostly the best way to control it, and unfortunately, it's chemical control, whether it's injecting or foliar spray, which we're going to talk about later, but it's just so aggressive. Okay. So now we are on to our woody species. So these are going to be our shrubby, you know, once again, herbaceous is just lacking a woody stem. So these are the opposite. And we're gonna talk about our honeysuckles. That is something, I'm gonna take a quick drink of water. Honeysuckles are probably the biggest thing I deal with just on a day-to-day basis. They can grow very tall. They can grow up to 16 feet in height. And I have a couple slides dedicated to this, so there'll be more pictures. But yeah, they can just look like a small tree. The stump can get to be, you know, on average, the stump is going to be, you know, maybe like this, but a lot of the ones I removed can be up to this size or larger. So they're very much like a small tree. If we look at, so I've got 3 different species of honeysuckle that we're going to really focus on. So there's a myrrh, which I think is probably what we mostly see. That's what I see a lot of at the preserves. Which if you look at the picture that says a myrrh, it has, and they all have opposite leaf arrangements. So they all have leaves that come out directly across from each other. All of them have leaf margins that are entire. So those are the similarities. They all produce colorful berries and, you know, really beautiful flowers in the spring. So let's start to talk about what the differences are. So when we look at the leaf shape on a myrrh, it's much more oval, and then it really comes down to this this point or tip at the end. And the leaves just to me seem like they're larger. Then when we look at marrows, it's broadest just before the end of the leaf. So that in the picture labeled marrows, and there's also this picture that compares these 3 different honeysuckle leaves. You can see that it really kind of gets broad right there at the end, which isn't, you know, it's not always the best way to tell because once again, leaf shapes can vary. But when you look at what a myrrh leaf shapes look like, and then when you look at the Tatarian, it's very different from those. So the Tatarian is very distinctive because right where the leaf comes out of the stem, it's got like kind of a flat little base. So instead of coming to a taper, it's got this flat base and it can almost be a little bit heart-shaped. So those are the differences in the leaves. Now you'll see in that picture, there's one more species that I have labeled, and I didn't include it as a whole because Bell's honeysuckle is a hybrid of Tatarian and Marrow's. So it's a little bit of a mix there, but I really love that picture because it does, you know, show some of the differences. Bottom line is they're all invasive. We don't have, our native honeysuckle is actually a vine. If you go way up north, like really north and more toward Canada, there are native honeysuckle bushes, but they're just not common here. They don't occur here really as naturally. So yeah, so if you're looking at a honeysuckle bush, it's going to be invasive. You can see that the flowers, they're irregular. They have 5 petals, and they come in a variety of colors. So Maros and Amur flowers are white, and then we have Tatarian, which has, they can be really beautiful too. They're white, pink, and red. So they can kind of be all 3. Those come out in probably like May. And you can see them when you walk the trails. You'll see all those white and pink flowers. Then, you know, as we go through the growing season, toward the end of the summer, you know, going late summer into fall, we start to see the berries, and they all, so Amur is the only one that has strictly red berries. Maros and Tatarian can have orange to red. And Tatarian I've almost always seen with the orange. That's just what I've seen around here. But yeah, we'll start to see those berries at that time of the year, and the birds really love them. Like I said, you know, they can't help it. They look appetizing, they're edible for them, and you know, they're everywhere. Okay, we've got a question. So if you see a woody with opposite leaves sprouting in your yard that you didn't plant, can you safely assume it is a honeysuckle and remove it before flowering? I wouldn't do that without really ensuring that it's a honeysuckle, just because we do have dogwoods and viburnums, which can look very similar. Now, when they flower, you'll be able to tell the difference. And when they berry, you'll be able to tell the difference. Dogwood has really pretty white berries with like a pink stem. And both of them have clustered flowers that come out as a round cluster at the top. And I actually think that viburnum has toothed leaf margins. So I would say no. You know, I know that we want to get rid of these really quick, but make sure that you're 100% sure. We are going to look at, okay, but their leaves look really different. Okay. We are going to look at the bark right now. And so that might really help you, because the bark and the, when you cut the honeysuckle, there's a really distinctive feature that we'll look at right now. But also, I love getting pictures. I love when people ask me. I did a lot of different yard visits this year. I do it on my own time. I really love coming out to somebody's yard and taking a look, and you know, we're all here to help each other, and there's a lot of resources. So if anybody ever does have a question about something in their yard, I am more than happy to take pictures and to help out with that. Okay, so now we can look at the bark characteristics of all 3 species. So when it comes down to it, they're all pretty flaky. They all have streaky bark. Amur is, to me, is one of the most common ones around here, and it just has this streaky, stripy. Some of it, the bark flakes. It can have deep rivets in the bark as well. Like as it gets older and matures, furrows in the bark can become deeper. So that's the thing. All of these plants look much different from when they're younger to when they're older. But one of the biggest distinctive features about honeysuckles, and this is actually how you distinguish a invasive honeysuckle from a native bush honeysuckle, but like I said, we don't deal with that here, is when you cut the stem, the 2nd year stem. So like say it's just a sapling and it's just popping up, one stem is coming up, that's a sapling. You're not going to see this in a sapling. But if you have a established honeysuckle bush, if you cut the stem, there's going to be this brown pith in the middle. And depending on the species, it's going to be wider or narrower, and it's going to be hollow in the middle. So this is the distinguishing characteristic in my mind of how we can do that. So if you have that bush that's in your yard, if you're wondering about it, and if it's established enough, it's got, you know, quite a few branches, just prune it, and, you know, make sure you're going to cut it at a growing point so that it can keep growing in a healthy formation. But cut that stem and check if the middle is hollow or has that brown pith. And like I said, I love to take pictures and check that stuff out. So I hope that helps. Okay, so here we have the picture on the left is actually, there's jet bed in there too, which is another invasive that we're not going to talk about because it's not very common. But one of the habits of honeysuckle, especially, and how I can easily monitor for it in the winter time, is that it will keep its leaves much later in the season, and they'll just turn like a pale yellow, pale green. And so when you look, you know, out into the woods, when everything has died back, it's just super easy to see them because nothing else is growing and it's the only, you know, green you're seeing. Now, once again, you know, you got to walk out to the plant, you really got to properly identify it, but it's a really good indicator that it could be honeysuckle. And so you can go investigate it or check it out. I guess that's something I would ask about the bush in your yard is, does it keep leaves on through the year? So yeah, so this is a lot of times how I will go out into the parks and preserves, because in the summer, there's so much growing in the understory, we don't really, you know, it can be hard to see this growth like this. And when you look at that picture on the right, you can see beneath all the leaves, it's just tangled, and a lot of honeysuckles grow in an arching formation. Some of them will grow arching almost to the ground. And just like garlic mustard and Dame's rocket, honeysuckle is allelopathic. So what I've noticed when I'm removing big stands of honeysuckle is there's absolutely nothing that grows on the ground underneath except for moss. And once again, that depends on the site that you're starting at. Is it a high quality site? Is it a low quality site? But it really just sucks the life out of those areas. So. Okay, so another woody species that we deal with a lot is autumn olive. One of the things, so autumn olive and honeysuckle both can occur in the same environments. They both can occur in the forest understory and also in open grass areas, although honeysuckle is not quite as prevalent, but autumn olive really loves full sun and open grassland areas. One of the reasons that we do prescribe burning at our Davis Foster Preserve is to just keep those honeysuckles, or I'm sorry, not honeysuckles, to keep those autumn olives out of the prairie. They really like open grassland areas. They can absolutely grow in the forest though, especially in some of our oak areas like at Lake Lansing North, where it's a historic oak forest, and they like having openings. Oaks grow so that they can create openings. Autumn olives can be really prevalent there. So as we're looking at these pictures, there's a lot of things that we can see. So autumn olive can grow up to 20 feet, but the thing about autumn olive is it also can grow 30 feet out. So it can just take over. When you're driving 127 north, if you look at some of the areas that are off the highway, it's just covered in autumn olive. So once it's established, it can really take off. So you can differentiate it from honeysuckle very easily, I believe, because first it has alternate leaves. So instead of opposite, they're coming out at different areas on the stem. And it is literally a sparkly, shiny plant. So and I think these pictures do a very good job illustrating that. It's just the top of the leaf is a pale, or not pale, it's a dull green. And as you can see too, the leaf margins are entire, but they get wavy. So sometimes they almost look toothed just because they're a little wavy. But yeah, the top of the leaf is a dull green, but as soon as you flip it, it's this shiny, like sparkly silver. And so it's very speckled. So the underside of the leaves are speckled. The stem is speckled. I have another picture of a stem on the next slide that shows you that. And then the fruit is speckled. So the whole plant, like even when you look at this picture, so this was just taken right outside the service center at Nancy Moore Park, Central Park area. And you can just see looking at those autumn olives, they just look silver, you know, and especially on a windy day and you can see the leaves pop up. So for me, they're very easy to spot from far away because of that silver color. They have regular flowers that are this yellowish to white color. And those come out probably like midsummer, and then the berries follow right after. And once again, it's a plant where the leaves and the berries can kind of persist through the winter time, although I don't see them on the autumn olives quite as much. Okay, so here we have some more pictures of the twigs, and that the one that I'm holding the twig in my hand, I just think you can just see it right there. It's just, it's so speckled and almost shiny. Now that is a new growth stem. So as autumn olive starts to age, it goes from like a rusty to like a darker brown, silvery color. So all of these shrubby species, their bark will change color and shape as they age. So as you can see in the top right corner, some of the newer stems are darker brown, they're more speckled, they're smoother, and then that really big stem right in the middle is almost like flaky and looks more like rough bark. It's starting to split. So it really does look very different. The annoying thing about autumn olive is that it can grow from its root crown, or if you cut it, it can sprout right from that cutting. And I forgot to mention this, but honeysuckle is the same way. So we'll talk about how we manage these, but that's why I manage these kind of species with a cut stump treatment, where after we cut them, we paint them with herbicides so that it slows down. And I say slows down because it can still pop from that, but it's not as likely. But they're very resilient. When you cut them, it's almost like they come back more aggressively. So we can see the alternate twigs really well in the picture with the circles. One thing that you need to be careful of when you're removing autumn olive is that it can have very sharp, thorny growths on the bark. They're not actually, they're not prevalent throughout the whole branch consistently, but they're definitely there enough where you can get yourself really good. So just be careful and make sure you're wearing good gloves if you're handling it. One of the interesting things about it is that it has these root nodules that are actually have nitrogen fixing fungi that can grow on them. And this allows it to colonize those really dry, barren sites. So that picture I had in the other slide, where it's just kind of growing outside the parking lot over here, outside of the building, that open grassy area gets dry as a bone in the summer, and the autumn olive can really thrive there. And, we'd think that would be a good thing, that it has these nitrogen fixing fungi, that maybe that would help the soil. But really it's only making the soil good for itself. And it's so aggressive that it doesn't end up benefiting anything else. That it really just makes it grow better and more aggressively. So autumn olive and honeysuckle are both plants that were widely planted for soil stabilization and for wildlife habitat. So that's unfortunate. And once again, both have berries that birds will eat. Okay, so we're just really going to lightly touch on Russian olive. We don't see Russian olive I don't know if I really hardly ever remove it here, but it can occur, and it's very similar to autumn olive. It takes more of a tree form instead of growing like out and huge. Um, and if we look at those leaves pictured there, it just has very narrow leaves, but same kind of habit, same speckled, sparkly undersides, silvery undersides. One of the differences is that too, that it has the silver speckles both on top and below the leaf. And the leaves are much narrower, and it can often be mistaken for willow. So you have to be careful there. Okay, let me see what time it is. All right, why don't we, since it's almost 11:30 and we're about to get into privet, why don't we take a quick stretch break, run to the bathroom. I'm going to excuse myself and get some water. So everyone just take about 5 minutes and we'll be right back. Let's say 11:35. Okay. All right. So I guess we got one more minute here. Okay. All right. Let's continue. Before we go on, I just want to reiterate that I'm very thankful that everyone was able to participate. There's a lot of people that are going to be receiving the recording that couldn't make it today. I will be sending the recording as well as my presentation out to you, and resources, a resource packet, if you will. Like I said, there are so many different species that I deal with every day, and I'm continually learning. I went into schooling for wildlife management and biology, so I'm always learning about plants, and I appreciate all the questions. And please don't be afraid to ask me anything after this, or if you need any resources. I have a lot of great connections to amazing people in the community. So, all right, let's continue. All right, so our next species is European privet, and this is where I actually got my first real removal experience, was with privet. And it was funny because I didn't know what it was at first, and quite a few of my colleagues didn't know what it was at first either, because sometimes privet it's not as common as some of like the honeysuckle and the autumn olive and the buckthorn that we're going to go over. But when it does happen in natural areas, it can form really dense hedges and monocultures, because that's what it's planted for, is as a natural hedge. So European privet is, a deciduous woody shrub like all of our others. It's a very stemmy. So when you see a parent plant, there's always a lot of little stems coming out beneath, and there's a lot of stems that come out from the parent root crown. It does grow up to 15 feet tall, but I've definitely seen it taller than that. Just like the honeysuckle and the autumn olive, it can get quite thick at the base. So the stump can be, anywhere from, little tiny baby saplings to a lot of things I cut are probably about that, maybe bigger than a quarter, like a silver dollar. But it can get more in this range of 6 to 7 inches in diameter. It has opposite leaf arrangement, just like the honeysuckle, but some of the leaves do look very different than the honeysuckle. The honeysuckles are kind of, I don't know, they just kind of have more of a dull, like almost mottled look. And the privet has these really smooth, kind of glossy looking leaves. And the leaf margins are entire. So they're smooth, they're not toothed. The leaf shape can vary. So I have pictures on the next slide too that really illustrate this, but they can be longer and kind of more slender, like you see in the one picture. But then they can also be broader in the middle of the leaf in a more rounder shape. So it just kind of depends. I always really look at the bark that we will look at in the next slide. It's very different than honeysuckle. So the flowers are these, they kind of come out in these clusters at the terminal end of the branch. They're, regular shape, and they aren't, to me, as noticeable as when the berries come out. So when the berries come out, we also call these drupes, and they're this kind of oval teardrop shape. So they're not completely round like we saw with the autumn olive, but they're more of an oval. And they're this very deep purpley black. they are poisonous to humans, which I didn't even know that. I mean, luckily I don't ever try to eat them on the job. You know, it's just a golden rule of thumb to not eat anything that you don't know what it is. But birds do eat them heavily, and they, you know, they grow by the trail, so they drop onto the trail, and we track them with our boots. So here is what the bark looks like, and you know, it's very different than the honeysuckle. It's more of a smooth gray to kind of tannish, and it has these little speckled lines. They almost look like lenticels, which are these corky growths that we'll see really well when we look at buckthorn, but they are not lenticels truly, and they're just these little speckles. Now, the thing that I always notice about privet too that's very different is, I mean, it's opposite, just like the other, you know, just like honeysuckle and dogwood and viburnum, but it has this just really distinct like ladder shape. You know, it almost looks like a stick bug. I don't know what it is. I just, when I see it, I know it's privet because it looks like you could almost climb up it. The other thing that's very noticeable in the winter is the droops. Once again, they persist through the winter time. They kind of turn this really dull, matted blue, black color, and they do persist through the winter. Leaves will kind of hang on as well. They just turn like a darker brownish green, pale yellow. The other thing with privet is that, just like autumn olive, it can have these little thorns. So just be careful when you're removing it. As we can see in this picture where it's being cultivated, it's just insanely thick. So the first management that I performed was privet along the Grand River, and it was just like a tunnel. You know, the paths that were through it, it will just grow so thick. And one of the most stark examples I have seen of it is if you go to Ted Blackwood's, which I love Ted Blackwood's, if you go to the entrance on Van Atta Road, if you look to the property directly across the street, and once again, please, you know, I do not believe in making anybody feel anything about a plant that they plant. These are things that are sold at nurseries and at, you know, Horrocks. I love Horrocks, and they sell all kinds of invasive plants. But it's a great example of, they have privet planted along both sides along the road, and it's probably about 15 feet tall, and it's super thick. And when you do walk into Ted Black, right along that beginning of the trailhead, you see a lot of privet, and it gets very thick there. And so you have to wonder, are the birds eating it from there, bringing it over here? Because Ted Black is a very, that north end of it is a very beautiful oak forest that definitely needs some love, but historically it's an oak forest, and it has some really impressive native species there. So we know that the privet's not naturally just occurring and falling into there easily. It's definitely being tracked in, it's being eaten by birds and dispersed. So that, unfortunately, is the story of all invasives. Okay, here we come to buckthorn, which some of you might have a lot of experience, that you probably spent a lot of hours removing this. The reason why I say that too is, in Meridian, we are blessed to have so many wetlands here in this township, but with wet comes buckthorn. So autumn olive, honeysuckle, privet, they are mostly found in these upland areas. Privet can definitely, and honeysuckle can kind of make their way anywhere, but buckthorn is a very big indicator of when you start getting into wet territory. Now there is common and there's glossy. In the next few slides, we're going to go over exactly how we tell the difference. We want to remove both of them, but again, it's very important to accurately identify a plant before you move it, even if you know they're both invasive. So glossy, speaking of wetlands, is definitely occurs more often in wetland habitats. It really does like its feet wet, so to speak. And glossy is the one that we really think of displacing a lot of wetland natural communities. Common likes to grow in wet sites, but it can handle drier areas. So we'll see common more on those outskirts and drier areas. As you can see, they both have alternate leaf arrangement, but it looks pretty close to opposite. So that's that word again, sub-opposite, where it's alternate, but it looks really close. So even when there's no leaves on the stem, you should be able to identify this characteristic by looking, and you can see where the leaf buds out. They'll just be a little off center from each other, so not quite opposite. So they're both alternate. They both have these oval shaped leaves, and that's where we start to see some of the differences. So again, we want to focus on the differences. Common is going to have toothed edges, and they're very little tiny teeth with fine teeth. But when we look at glossy, it's an entire margin and there's no teeth. Another thing that we tend to look at is the veins. The veins on common, they distinctively curve toward the tip of the leaf. And then in glossy, you can they just go out to the margins of the leaf. There's also in common a little short spine that grows at the tip of the stem. Oh, as far as height goes, and I do believe I have another picture. Oh, I thought I had a picture of how tall they can get. They can get very tall. They can basically look like a small tree. And they're not shrubby like the autumn olive and the honeysuckle can be, where they're like just like this kind of round mass. Buckthorn is definitely, it grows up more similar to a tree. We got a question here. Which one gets spines at the tip again? So that's going to be the common. It's going to be the common buckthorn. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the habit, it looks more like a tree, and the bark is this, let's see, oh, I do have the slide. Okay, well, let's go back and talk about these flowers. Okay, getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, so the flowers are also a little different. Now, I personally haven't, I just haven't noticed the flowers on it before. I always just really see the berries. They just stick out to me. But the glossy has a regular flower that has 5 petals. And then the common is also a regular flower, but it has 4 petals. And you can really see the difference in those pictures. But they're both whitish. But the common is definitely going to be more of a yellowy green. And so once the flowers hit, midsummer, those berries follow again. And the common has these really deep, dark berries. And just in case you're thinking back to that privet, these berries are much rounder and circular. The privet, that's why I like referring to them as those drupes, because they kind of look like a little droop. So the buckthorn, you can see they have these really plump, round berries, and the common is going to be a dark purple black, and then the glossy actually has red berries that ripen to black. But the interesting thing is that they produce so heavily that you can see the flowers, red berries, and blackberries on the same plant. I haven't seen that, but it can occur that way. There is a native there's a native buckthorn called alder buckthorn that has really beautiful red berries, and the leaves are quite different, and it's a very rare species. And we do actually have some that occurs in one of our land preserves. So it does exist. I had never heard of it until this year. I just thought all buckthorn was basically not native. So, and I had never seen it before. But yeah, you can really see the differences in these two pictures with the berries and the leaves especially as well. Oh, and I wanted to say too, the winter fruits, that's, once again, it's just important for monitoring, for investigating. It's just such an easy way to pick out a plant in the winter when there's nothing growing and you can see a bunch of black drupes or berries hanging, and then you can go investigate further once you see that. Okay, so here we come to the bark, and these are those lenticels I was talking about. They're like these corky tissue, and there's some species like birch that has lenticels, but they're not all true lenticels. But buckthorn does exhibit these. We can see that with the common, it's much less dense with lenticels. It's also a little bit lighter in color. The glossy is really heavily speckled, and it's just really dark. There's that picture I was talking about below the glossy bark picture. That is a really, that's a very common habit for a buckthorn. So we can see that the base is definitely more confined, just two stems, or, you know, sometimes it's just one stem, and then it comes up and branches out. So it's more like a tree. And that buckthorn is really interesting because it has a multiflora rose that grows over top of it too. So it's just an invasive gateway. But you can tell that I mean, that picture is obviously facing the sun, but the bark is just very, very dark. It's almost a black. With common buckthorn, technique you can use to identify it is you can scrape away the bark and it's orange underneath. But sometimes, you know, just like any ID characteristic, that can vary. One thing I wanted to say about buckthorn is, for Meridian Township, I would say it's a priority species because the types of communities that it's taking over, like we said, are wetlands. So we'll talk about that later, but when we're thinking of prioritizing, we want to know what kind of ecosystems or habitats or natural areas these invasives are going to be taking over. And so buckthorn is one of those. And it can be very difficult to keep eradicated because it can sprout, it can re-sprout from stumps very easily, and those berries are really prolific. Okay, this is one, and buckthorn is one that is also sold as a horticultural planting, which is unfortunate. So things like that still get planted for landscaping, which leads us into Japanese barberry, which, like I was saying, with a lot of businesses, this is their standard go-to for landscaping. They sell these at Horrocks, like I mentioned, and I love Horrocks, but I wish they wouldn't sell Japanese barberry. This is an invasive that is very interesting in its shape, in its leaf shape. So its leaves are very, like more like a teardrop shape. They're alternate, which kind of adds to its interesting shape. It's a smaller shrub, so the past few shrubs we've been talking about are very large. They're more like a tree or bush. This is more like a small shrub. So this one can sprawl more than anything, more than it gets tall. I would say that I've never seen it over 4 feet tall, 4.5 feet tall. Not that it can't happen that way, but generally arches. And it has these really attractive bright red berries that persist through the winter, which is one of the reasons that people do like to plant it. They're very bright red, which makes it a really easy species to track in the off season. And, I notice that it doesn't occur as densely as our buckthorns and our honeysuckles. It's generally pretty easy to control as long as you get a handle on it. But it really likes to occur in some of our like beech maple forests, oak forests. It's not something you're going to see out in an open grassland area or prairie area. Not that it can't persist. I mean, it definitely can take full sun. I mean, when you see it planted at businesses, that's how it's planted. But I personally see it in our wooded areas. And I do often see it in wet areas. So we've got these little oval spoon-shaped kind of teardropped leaves. We have regular flowers, which they're arranged in these little clusters. Once again, I have not seen the flowers of Japanese barberry. I always just see the berries. And then the berries are more like the privet, where that oval, they're an oval egg shape. And they persist through the winter, and they are eaten by birds. The one thing I wanted to mention is the way that these arch, once they hit the ground, they can also start rooting down wherever they touch the ground, which can make it difficult to manage and pull, because it's also spiny. As you can see, those very sharp spines, but they're very straight. They're not curved at all. They're very straight. And so when we deal with this species, we do that cut stump method where we cut it and dab the stump. I've noticed that it's also this really intense yellow when you cut it. The inside wood is very like this yellowy orange color. Okay, now we're on to multiflora rose, which is an insanely dangerous plant that I have lost some of my nice outdoor gear to because of how sharp the spines can be. So there are native roses in Michigan. So when you see it occurring, you're gonna think rose. You're gonna look at it and be like, oh, that's a rose. It's got the toothed leaf margins. And this is one thing that I want to explain really quick is we haven't talked about compound leaves yet, but when we look at this rose stem with the photo on the bottom with the big circle, that whole growth in that circle is one leaf. So that's called a compound leaf. So it's a leaf that's made up of several leaflets, basically. So it does have a very traditional rose look. The flowers look like rose flowers. There's 5 petals, and it's followed by rose hips. So all of this is very rosy. But one of the big differences in the distinguishing factor is the fringe that occurs at the base of the leaf. So I know this picture has a lot of green in it, but if you look closely, there's like this fringe that comes right out at the base of where our little compound leaf comes out. And that is a really big distinguishing factor of multiflora rose. The other thing that I really look for is it has a recurved thorn. So it bends backwards. So the plant grows out like an arch, and the thorn actually grows backwards from the arch. The thorns are very broad at the base, and they come to a very sharp curved point. generally our roses are not occurring in that same fashion. The thorns do not occur in that fashion. But, you know, remember that we do have brambles. We have native species that are similar. So we really want to look for that fringe. The roses are, or the flowers are going to be a white to pink in color. And there's a picture down here at the corner too that shows just how large the plant can get. So that is another difference with traditional roses, is this thing can just be huge, and it will also climb small shrubs and trees. It doesn't climb in the traditional sense, but it will just start growing and arching over another shrub or tree, and it will take it over. It's just an insane plant. One thing I wanted to mention is it is another that was introduced. So it was introduced in like 1860s to cultivate for horticulture. And then it got taken up by, I think, the Soil Conservation District to stabilize soil. They planted it in medians of highways for a while to act as cushioning, which I don't know why you would want to run into a multiple rows. It's so sharp and painful. So once again, it kind of spread, and the rose hips can be eaten, and when they drop, they're viable for 10 to 20 years. So it's one of those that you just got to keep plugging away at and be very careful when you remove it. Okay, Oriental bittersweet. This is a vine species. It's still a woody species, but it's a vine. This one just really breaks my heart. It's the reason that I have a difficult time with this one is that it is just so aggressive, and it's still widely sold to use as decoration, because I mean, look at those berries with the orange capes. It's a beautiful fall decoration, though. You know, the berries are coming out in the fall, and in the winter they persist just like that. I mean, you can see snow on that branch, and you know, people love to use it as a fall decoration, and I totally understand that. I love using natural materials to decorate, but you really need to understand what you're using. Once again, I've been to a lot of local stores where they were selling actual Oriental bittersweet as a decoration, real. And when I spoke to them, you know, once again, I'm not here to be people's moms and make them feel bad. I just wanted them to be aware, you know, hey, this is this vine, it's just, it really can wreck natural areas. I just, you know, wondered if you had, you know, do you want more information on it? I just worry that you're selling it. And whenever I bring that question up, there's not even a knowledge about that vine, and that there are other varieties, and that this is a variety that's not native. So once again, it's just a lack of awareness. We do have a Native American bittersweet, and we're going to go over the difference between the native and the invasive. But when we look at the leaves, so we have toothed leaves, and they're this big kind of oval shape, but the leaves are hard to go by because they can really vary. So when we look at this picture at the bottom here, and I thought I had an even better picture, but we can see these new vines coming up, and the leaves they're consistently in oval shape, but like that new growth, it's like oval, and it comes into a point almost like a heart. But then when we look at this other picture where we can see the green fruit, it's just very oval, you know, and it doesn't look necessarily the same. So leaf shape can be difficult to go off of, but it is the only vine that I see that has this leaf shape. So we have native vines. If you look in that corner of the picture with the green fruits, right up in the right-hand corner of that picture, there's a plant that has 5 leaves on it, and that's called Virginia creeper. That is a vine that we have that's native. Grapevines are native. You can see a grapevine in this bottom picture here mixed in with the Oriental bittersweet. And then we have poison ivy, which is a native vine. So this is the only vine you're going to be seeing that has this shaped leaf. And none of our native vines have that kind of shape. So that's a really good thing to look for. As it grows, the habit is really what gives it away. When we look at the middle picture where it's climbing, it climbs as tall as a tree is. So it can easily go 90 feet, 100 feet up in the air. It will just keep climbing the tree. It has a very aggressive, tight wrapping. Like Virginia creeper, it doesn't destroy trees because it doesn't wrap tightly. It actually just kind of like starts growing different sections of vine. But Oriental bittersweet wraps really tight. And I've seen trees where it's growing out of the vine and the vine's just growing with it. And the base of an Oriental bittersweet stump can be, easily 7 inches in diameter. So it can get very thick and climb very aggressively. And what that does is it inhibits the tree from growing properly. It can inhibit photosynthesis when it starts to go out on other branches and it covers up leaves. I've seen it just completely take over forest and trees just fall and they're wrapped up in the vines. So it's just very aggressive. It has an alternate leaf shape. And like we mentioned, the margins are toothed. The flowers now are, they are different depending on the sex of the plant. So you can see the male flowers are much smaller. And then they turn into these, they turn into that green fruit first, and then they finally turn into the red with the orange to yellow cape. Now this is important where these grow, because it's the only difference between the Oriental and the American. So the Oriental the berries grow out of along the stem at the leaf axils. So it grows all the way down the stem. When we look at, when we look at our native species, it grows at the terminal end of the stem. So it grows on the very end of our vine stem. Invasive Oriental bittersweet grows at each leaf axil. So that's going to be a big difference. The native species also has narrower leaves. So instead of the big oval shape, it's more like this shape. But the problem with that is the Oriental has now been shown to hybridize, and it can have both leaf shapes. So it's difficult to tell the difference based on that. But if you look at the leaf shape, if you look at the berries, and then you look at the habit, like I said, invasive bittersweet is not going to grow out of control like the Oriental. If you look at this top right corner picture, that is Anderson Nature Park close to my house. And I just took that last week. And it's just really sad to see it. And you can kind of see it in the picture, just barely see the red and the orange berries throughout, but that is Oriental bittersweet vine without its leaves, climbing that big white pine. And the thing that we can see from this last slide is it will really cover the ground as well. So it will reproduce from the seeds it drops. So when we have a big climbing vine like the one in this top middle picture, their seeds are going to drop from that. So it's going to be a parent seed producing vine. Birds are going to eat it as well. But the problem with this vine is it also regenerates from the root crown, and it also regenerates from all of its root system. So not only can it take over vertically, but it can also take over the ground surrounding that tree. And another thing that it says in here is they did a study where they found that the seeds can last in a bird's gut for 14 to 42 days. So think about how much area that bird can cover until it disperses that seed. So it's just so effective at spreading. It's really good at seed dispersal and growing from the root. And you can, in this picture of the roots too, they're this really bright orange color. Okay, we got a question or a comment. Is this one we can spread on our shoes? That's a good question. So I see that when I walk the trail, where they're like this trail that has that big climbing Oriental bittersweet vine, I always see seeds in the middle of the trail or smashed. And the fact that the seed can last in a, can go through the acid of a bird's stomach, if we get that in our shoe and then we carry it around and then we drop it, we can definitely spread it on our shoes. So ways to combat that are to clean your boots. You can, what I use for volunteers is just a simple hoof brush for like a horse or a cow. I grew up with horses, so I kind of just, you can go to Tractor Supply and get one, but any kind of brush really, but it has a nice pick on it too. And you can just keep it in your car or whatever. And then you can scrape your boots off, in the parking lot, where the seed isn't going to do as much damage as, taking it into a natural area and spreading it. Good question. Okay, and when we look at the bark, it does have those, once again, something that looks kind of like lenticels, but they're not actually lenticels. They're these horizontal marks, and it gets more furrowed at the bigger it gets and the older the stem gets. And like I said, they can get super thick. Okay, I just want to make sure I got everything on this page. So, on that note too, before we move on from Oriental bittersweet completely, because it is such an important invasive species to me, there's really great fake Oriental bittersweet vines that you can get that, they look just as nice. If you're ever buying anything for fall decoration at a local store or a plant nursery, just be so careful. And I just visited a resident this summer who lives over by Glendale Cemetery, which is where all those pictures were taken, where it's covering the trees. I mean, it's just out of control over there. And, we had been in contact, and she said, yeah, I've got this plant. And she's like, it's taking over my yard. And if you could come out and look at it and tell me what to do. And so I came out and I said, yeah, that's Oriental bittersweet. And she said, well, it's weird because I harvest American bittersweet from the cemetery every year, and I use it as a decoration. And, I was like, I think that you've been harvesting Oriental bittersweet, and because right where she had her infestation was where she'd been dumping it and she'd been composting it. So that's another thing. If you are using natural vegetation, just be very careful composting it, because a compost is just a great place for seeds to flourish and to grow. So in a way, when she was throwing it out there, she was just kind of planting the seed. And that's another thing. If you do think you see American bittersweet, it is actually, it's basically endangered. If it's not on the endangered list, it's a very uncommon native species for us to find. So if you do find it, don't harvest it for decoration anyway, just because it's very rare. Okay, so now we are moving, we're done with our identification. If anybody has questions, I realized 5 minutes into starting this presentation that I forgot my slide on Phragmites, which is just crazy because Phragmites is a huge invasive species that everyone needs education on. I did have a picture of it in the first slide, and so I will be sending that out in my note with the recording to just make sure that I'm going to send you resources on how to identify it. But if you've ever driven down Okemos Road and you pass Nob Hill Apartments, that huge area of just big tall grasses with big seed heads on them that fall basically onto the sidewalk, that's Phragmites, and that's an aquatic invasive species. And I will definitely send more information out on that. But before we move on, does anyone have questions on identification? Okay, moving on up. All right, so when we're talking, oh wait, we did get one question. Are there examples of successful control or eradication of invasive species? Back in the day, we heard a lot about purple loosestrife being such a big problem. Not so much anymore. Any updates on the control of this plant? Rita and Bruce, that is a great point to bring up, and kind of what we're going to be moving into now. There is successful control, and there's certainly, and like I said, we're going to talk about this all right now. But you know, things like garlic mustard, if you are consistent about picking garlic mustard, and even though, I mean, seeds can persist in the soil for a long time, you know, on the lesser end of how long they can persist, it's like 3 or 4 years. So either way, you're going to have to be doing this control for a while. But if you keep at garlic mustard, you can get it out of your area. And of course, you're always going to need to monitor. I mean, in this world that we live in now, you're just always going to have to monitor no matter what, because there's always things being introduced. But like honeysuckles can really successfully be eradicated. Things like buckthorn are harder. Like those are things that persist more. Oriental bittersweet really persists more. So when we're talking about purple loosestrife was that was kind of the poster child before, you know, when invasives first became this big awareness campaign. And they did use things like biological control, which biological control is when you take another species or organism and you kind of use it as like a natural predator or a competitor for that species. The problem with that is that, of course, it can backfire, and you can get an invasive species from introducing a biological control. So I think people kind of shied away from biological control after that happened a couple times. I know that there was some successful biological control for purple loosestrife. There was also successful control with chemical control. And it really is suppressed these days. Do I still see it? Yes, 100%. I still see it, especially here in Meridian Township, because it's a wet species, and this is a wet township. And it can definitely get out of control. But I have personally eradicated a patch of purple loosestrife on the river, and I haven't seen it. And when I do see it, it's just a flower here or there. So that's the update I have. We definitely don't see it like we used to. So if we keep being persistent, if we're as persistent as invasive species are, we can do it. Great question and point to bring up. Okay, so when we're thinking about management, and of course I think about management as somebody who, I'm a land manager for a living. That is my job at Meridian Township. I'm the land stewardship coordinator. I oversee all the stewardship across all 1,700 acres, 1,600 acres of land here, parks and preserves. So right now, a big part of stewardship means invasive management. But can we take that into our own yards? Heck yes, absolutely. So some of this, you know, it's gonna be from my perspective as managing, you know, over almost 2,000 acres, and also the perspective of, I also live on an acre and I can manage that. So we're kind of span the whole thing. So every single situation should be treated individually. There's a lot of factors that you can think about when you're going to control an invasive species. But, so I have my commercial pesticide applicator license, and that certifies me to treat invasive species in forests and, public natural areas. I can use restricted use, although I never use restricted use herbicide because it's just not necessary when in my work. But when I just had to get recertified for all of my my entire license, and the biggest thing that is drilled into your head is integrative pest management. So these invasive species are pests. So pests are anything it's anything that you want to get rid of in an environment because it's becoming out of control. And so when I approach an area, I don't just think, oh, we need to chemically control this. There are ways for each species, and each species reacts or responds differently and better to techniques. But there is a whole toolkit that we can use to do this and to do this management. So we're going to go over mechanical control, prescribed fire, and chemical control. Just kind of, we're not going to get super deep, but we're going to kind of breeze by these. So when we use integrated pest management, we're utilizing each one of these techniques. And so sometimes it depends on the species, sometimes it depends on the time of year, because species are going through their life cycle differently. So it all depends on that. Okay. Before we can even manage anything, before we can apply a chemical, before we can pull things out or burn something, we have to think about what is the priority. And whether you're thinking about an acre or 1,600 acres, there's things you can use. Obviously, if your landscape is getting bigger and bigger, your priorities might have to be changed around a little. But these are the important things to think about. First off, are there rare species nearby or that visit? Maybe like in this picture up on the right, that's blue vervain, and those are snowberry butterflies, and they're just amazing. They're also called, people know them as hummingbird. I think they call them moths, but they go by a lot of names, but they're absolutely incredible little fairy creatures. And they're not super, super rare, but they're an amazing native species that we want to protect. Blue vervain isn't super, super rare, but is it uncommon to see around here? Yes, especially when we used to see purple loosestrife instead of blue vervain. So these are things we have to think about. There's a tick trefoil pictured, which is a woodland species that we can see in a couple different places in the parks and preserves throughout the township. And it's not a species that you see all the time. It's not as common as some asters we might see, or maybe like black-eyed Susans or bee balm, things like that. So it's not the rarest, but is it rare? Yeah. So we want to be looking for things like that. If like I live next to a natural area, so I'm going to manage my land differently because I want to benefit that natural area. If you butt up to a park or a preserve in the township, which a lot of people do, you want to think about that. What is next to you? So that's something to think about. Are there native species around? Even if they're not rare, are there native species occurring? Because one of the biggest and the hardest lessons I had to learn as a land manager and somebody who does stewardship is you might remove all those invasives, but what's going to come back? you know, what's going to take its place? Is it a high enough quality environment that something good will come into its place? Or is it just going to refill with another invasive or more invasives? So that's something you really need to think about. You know, you got to work with the land. So is the land going to respect the work you're doing? Which is hard because I see some of these dense monocultures and basically hedges in the forest, and I want to remove them so bad and I want to get all of them out of there. But is that a good use of my time? Not necessarily. Do I want to eventually get rid of those areas and eradicate and remove those invasive species there? Yes, but is it the best use of my time right now? That area is already taken over. So there's not much we can do at that point besides keep that infestation contained. But maybe that infestation is starting to grow and start to set seeds in this really nice pawpaw grove right next to it that has really beautiful spring ephemerals that come up, you know, in the spring. So I'm going to focus on those little tiny populations that are making its way to this really nice high quality system we have. Like I said, not that we are going to ignore these monocultures, but we might want to put them on hold to save the native systems that are already in place that could go away if we let that dense monoculture spread any further. So a lot of times invasive species management is just about control. You know, we're really trying to get those small populations, because that's another thing. If you take out a small population area, you just eradicated the invasives from that area, and you can continue to monitor it and continue to remove anything new that comes up, and you just made that area clean again. So are you going to have to keep working against that wall of monoculture? Yes, but so what I'm saying is it's not always what we necessarily think. We don't always want to attack the biggest, we don't always want to run up the biggest hill, I guess I should say. Okay, we got some questions or comments. Does the township send developers information on invasive species? This is a great question. This is from Elizabeth, and this is something I'm trying to work into our contracts. And so one thing is this township is amazing. I mean, they've gotten so many grants this year. Like the farmers market just went in. And with that, they bring in landscapers, and I would like to see so many more native plantings. Everything that went in at the farmers market is fine. It's not going to spread. But would I like to see more native rare species that might occur on their own around here, or that maybe we could spread by planting native species? Absolutely. So something that we can do, and what my local SISMA coordinator helped me with, is we can put into a contract a no planting list. So if it's buckthorn, if it's honeysuckle, if it's this or that, you can't plant it. If it's on an invasive species list, you're not allowed to use it in your landscaping. And so that's something that I am working on. But I really like that in addition to being able to work it into the contract, so it's like a requirement, there needs to be education that goes out along with that. I am really happy at the farmers market because there's two big wet ditch areas that nothing was planted in. And I got the okay to do some native demonstration gardens there. And so I'm really happy about that. So a great opportunity to be able to educate. The next question: where do you get native plants to fill in? Every time we take an invasive out, another comes in. Yeah, so you know exactly what I'm talking about with, you might just be working so uphill. So for me, I can kind of choose when I'm managing in the parks and preserves, okay, this area is not going to be great. Let's just keep going over here where we have a nice high quality area. But as a landowner and as a property owner, that's not always your choice. You know, you're just trying to get invasives out of your yard or your acreage. And then, like you're saying, more are coming in. So something I'm working on that we're releasing in the spring is a planting. It's going to be called Planting a Native Meridian, and it's going to be a native plant program that's all about native gardening. And it's going to be a really great resource, for you to, for residents to see a whole list of native species that are beneficial, and what are their growing conditions, what do they look like, bloom, color, all that, and also a list of resources for local native nurseries. There are a lot of amazing nurseries out there doing great work, and they are, they go out to private landowners and they ask them, can I come on your property and harvest this native seed of this rare species or this really cool native plant? And that way they're also getting a local genotype seed, which is really great because all the insects and organisms in this area are adapted to local genotypes in different plants. So they are there. Those people are doing the work, and I will send information on that out. I will just say that there's design, I'm going to type it into the chat here, Designs by Nature, Vern Stevens. There's also Wild Type with Bill Schneider. I think I'm going to mess up his last name. I'll just put those in the chat just for you to check out, but I have a list of places nearby that you can absolutely get native plants, and they will help you understand, what's the conditions, this and that. And again, some native plants grow really well and they're easy to care for, and others take more nurturing and love, which is why native planting has taken a little longer to catch on. But once they're established, they are very low maintenance gardens, and it's awesome. Great questions. Great questions. Okay. So as I was saying, once we can prioritize an area, the next thing we want to think about is what kind of resources can we get to that site? And then do we have what we need to do it? So whether you're looking at, coordinating stewardship for a natural area or in your own yard, or, maybe you have some backwoods, are you able to get equipment back there to do the work? Do you have people who can help you? Because some of these management areas, it's so overwhelming to do on your own, and that's another thing is you can contract management companies to come in and use integrated pest management and help you with that work, but it costs money. It's dollars right there. So what is your situation? What do you have access to? What resources do you have? That totally goes into prioritizing. Oh, another thing, when you're thinking of, should I remove this or shouldn't? Is it next to a stream? Is it next to a river? Is it next to a trail? The thing with streams and rivers that's really bad is that's how Japanese knotweed got so bad, because it just kept spreading down these stream sides, and it's places where there's not a lot of people inhabiting that area. They're not really seeing the progress of that invasive species, or maybe seeds are being, because Japanese knotweed seeds can float on water, and different seeds disperse in different ways. So is it near something where it could really harm? Okay, so once we prioritize an area, the first thing that I do is I look for the biggest, baddest, specimen there. For example, with Oriental bittersweet, I'm going to be looking at those 70 to 90 feet tall vines that are all the way up a tree and that are just showering seeds everywhere every year. And birds are, and the thing with Oriental bittersweet is it has a very extensive root system. So If you've got, let's say you have honeysuckle in your yard and you have a bunch of little ones. And like I said, you definitely want to take care of the little stuff first, because it's gone, it's done, it's easy. But if you've got some that are just dropping a bunch of berries or a bunch of seeds, take those first and then work on your smaller populations, because those are just going to contribute to the problem over and over again. Okay, so we've got our management tools. Now that we've prioritized how we want to do the management, or where we want to do the management, sorry, then we want to decide how are we going to do the management. So the first management tool, we have and that we can use is mechanical. So mechanical is mowing. It can be, like hoeing, cultivation, and then the most common one is pulling. So our Dame's rocket and our garlic mustard, those and spotted knapweed are going to be species that we pull. And it's really great when you can, like I tell one of my friends who used to live in Lansing, she had garlic mustard in her backyard, and it was a big patch of it. And we had a party and we all went over there and we just all pulled, and we got, like I said, pizza goes great with garlic mustard. It's just so natural. So, it's a great way for other people to be educated, and it's a good way to get outside and spend time together. So when we're pulling invasive species, it's really great when you have a group of people. Can you do a lot of work on your own? Absolutely. There's a lot of people who manage it on their own properties, and they go out every single spring and they pull it. The biggest thing I want to say about mechanical is when you are pulling invasive species, make sure that you're getting the entire plant. It's just best to get as much of it out as you can, so that there's nothing left over. There's not root fragments that could possibly form. And again, if the seed pods are dry and you can see seeds falling out of them, don't harvest or don't pull them. Just leave them till next year, as hard as it may be. If it's a situation where you're in the middle of the woods and you just happened upon garlic mustard, that's different. But you really need to bag it, because otherwise you're going to spread it further. If you are bagging it in your own yard, some waste management companies like you to let them know. Granger, which is mine, didn't really care. They just said, as long as it's in a black bag and it's not overtaking your garbage receptacle, then that's fine. It doesn't hurt to let them know. Double bag it if you've got holes or if anything's poking out, because once again, it goes to, it goes somewhere else. And if it's falling out as it goes, it's going to be bad. Also, woody species can be managed this way when there's saplings. So we see, like, privet is especially a big one, where when you see a privet bush, you'll see a ton of little saplings underneath. And a lot of times, it almost looks like it's growing out of the roots, but it's really like the berries are just dropping directly underneath. And so those can be pulled out, and they don't have to be bagged. I like to pile them, so I know where they are, and they're all right there, and they don't reroot as long as you kind of like throw them up. And also the other thing is, make sure you're getting all the dirt off when you pull any plants out, because that dirt is important to that area. And we just need to make sure we're not causing an erosion problem at that point. Okay, another tool that's not always practical for private landowners, but certainly a tool you can use, is prescribed fire. So this is a really great tool to use, because it kind of has a double effect, where it controls invasive species, and it's also helpful to regenerate communities that have adapted with fire. So oak, right now we are planning to do a prescribed burn in Lake Lansing North. It was already burned about 6 years ago, and we have just seen an immense array of native species come up in that area that when you look at the other side of the trail that wasn't burned with prescribed fire, there's not nearly as much diversity. It's also a great regeneration tool for oaks. Oaks are adapted to fire. And so not only are you keeping the invasive species at bay, but you're also helping regenerate baby oaks. And oaks are one of the, they are an ecosystem that is in severe decline because we suppress fire so much. So it can be good for both. When we look at this picture in the top right corner, I actually can see it's burning autumn olive right now. So that's out at Davis Foster. That was a burn that took place out there 3 years ago. And then the bottom right picture is Davis Foster today. And when we look closely, we can see that there's Joe Pyeweed, there's bee balm, there's some blue vervain back there, but there's also some little autumn olives popping back up, but they're not huge. They're not 20 feet tall by 30 feet wide, and we can easily remove those at this point. So it can be really great for both forests and grassland habitats. Burns also happen on a cycle, so it can be a large investment for a private property owner, but it's a long-term investment and it can really be an effective management tool. And it, you know, it's not quite as expensive as one would think. So definitely something to look into as a possible tool. Okay, now we come to chemical control. And wow, we're really getting down to the hour here. We're almost done. I do want to really talk about chemical control because I think it's a difficult topic for a lot of people. And like I said, I worked on an organic farm for quite a few years. Chemical control is not the first thing I ever want to do. But do I think that it's an extremely effective tool in my tool belt? Absolutely. The thing is if you do everything correctly, if you're reading the label, if you are following directions precisely, and if you're ethical and responsible about the way that you apply chemical, it can be very effective and it doesn't have to have severely adverse effects. And there are different chemicals for different scenarios. So when I use a chemical in the township, it is a glyphosate, but it's a glyphosate that can be applied to both an aquatic and a terrestrial site. And the thing is that it binds, if any of it does fall off the plant, it can bind to a soil particle so that it doesn't leach into the water system, which the thing with chemicals like glyphosate is they can be so harmful to aquatic species. And that's when they can be really, really harmful. So if we can mitigate those actually getting anywhere near a water system until they, you know, because they don't persist forever. They do run their course, you know, in the soil. And so little small steps like that can be very helpful, especially in a township where we have a lot of wetlands. We want to protect our wetlands. Foliar spray. So there's different types of spray there's different types of chemical control, and it's going to be different depending on what kind of plant you're treating and what time of the year. So if you're treating during the growing season and you want to use chemical control, you're usually going to be doing a foliar spray. And a foliar spray is that it says it right there at the top of the screen. The guy with the backpack sprayer, that's when you're actually spraying the chemical onto the leaf so that it can translocate down into the root system. Foliar is the last type of chemical control that I ever want to use because you have less control over it. The thing is, though, is that your herbicide solution is only a 1 to 2% solution. So at least even though it is the least control, you're using the least concentrated form of herbicide in that control method. I reserve foliar application for when there's just totally dense monocultures, like the Oriental bittersweet that was at Harris Nature Center that's taking over their spruce forest. There's areas that I decided to do a foliar spray where it was just absolutely covering the ground and nothing else was there. Now, I don't do that for each area in there because not every single area is like that. If you're managing in your yard, just make sure that you are 100% reading the label front to back. It has really good information. That's what it's there for. You need to be using the proper PPE, so protective equipment. Always wear glasses, always wear gloves, especially when you're mixing. And make sure that you're, fencing off that area from your pets and your kids. I mean, if we're careful with these, outcomes will be much better. So you are responsible to take those extra precautions and do a responsible application. The treatment method that I mostly use is cut stump. So this is what I use on our woody species, privet, honeysuckle, autumn olive. And this doesn't happen during the active growing season because the energy is going into the leaves of the plant. It's being spread throughout the entire plant. When we head into fall, all of the energy is being, translocated down into the roots. And so we think about it kind of pulling the energy from the leaves. That's why leaves fall off the tree, because the tree or the shrub, because the plant is no longer putting energy into the leaves. So it's cutting off the energy supply. It's not photosynthesizing, and it's bringing it down into the roots. So when we do a cut stump, we cut 6 inches or lower, which I try to go as low as I can without, you don't want to go so low that when you paint the stump, you're getting herbicide on the surrounding soil and area. But low enough where it's not going to be a tripping hazard. And after you cut the stump, so if you look at the picture labeled cut stump, that's my husband, my best volunteer. He has an applicator that I actually was able to make. You can just make them out of PVC, valve, and a sponge, and you can slowly release herbicide down into where the sponge is, and then the sponge soaks with herbicide, and then you can dab the stump, and it's very controlled. It's not dripping, it's not spraying, you're not possibly getting a drift. You're just applying it directly to that stump, and that stump will pull the herbicide down into the roots, and that will help keep it from resprouting. So that is a technique that I mainly use, and it's cheap because you can make your own equipment. But you have to paint the stump as soon as possible after you cut it for it to be effective. But once again, now we're getting a more controlled method. And so our herbicide concentration is going up. So you can use a 20% to a 50% solution for cut stump. There's also basil bark, which is very effective for Oriental bittersweet, which I'm finding out. I hadn't had too much experience with that before. But it's kind of like a mix of cut stump and foliar, where you are using about a 23% is what is recommended solution of herbicide, but you also use it with an oil carrier or a surfactant that helps the herbicide penetrate the bark. So instead of doing a foliar spray and possibly getting a lot of drift in affecting non-target plants, you can go to each individual plant and you just, about 6 inches above the ground, you wet all the way around the stem, and it will soak into that stem and be translocated down to the roots. So this is really good if your plants are too tall for foliar application and it's not cut stump treatment time. So, because it can happen during the active growing season. So for example, I will basil bark treat Oriental bittersweet in the summertime. And then I also come in the winter and some of the stems that I didn't get to, I'll cut stump treat. And I can't foliar spray that because when it's 70 feet up into a tree. When it's just little growth, you can. But once again, as we're going through this, it all depends on the situation, what your plant is, what you're dealing with. And the other thing you have to think of when you do use chemical is that you can only apply so much per acre. So that's why you need to read the label, and that's why you need to be very responsible, protect yourself. Don't be silly about it. Oh, and there's also stump injectors, which can be really useful. They use them a lot for Japanese knotweed on small scales. If there's smaller populations, if you've got like what the backpack sprayer guy is dealing with, you don't want to inject every single stem. But if you have a smaller population, you can use an injector and it goes right into the stem. So it's super controlled. It doesn't drift anywhere. And the great thing is you can actually rent these from your local conservation district. So ours would be the Ingham Conservation District. And I have resources at the end for that. And they actually train you on how to use it and how to be safe. Okay. So our very last thing is that, once you go through all this work, now you have your monitoring. You can't just treat invasives one time and then walk away. Oriental bittersweet persists, the seeds persist in the soil for 9 years. So you have to just keep at it. And it's another one of those things that makes treating invasives all the more frustrating, but why are you going to, don't do the work if you're not going to keep monitoring it and keep on it. So like I said, garlic mustard, just go out and pick it every year. Pick it, Dame's Rocket, same thing, just keep at it, just keep at it. When we monitor, it's really good to take pictures, take notes. I have a before and after on the last slide, just and sometimes you forget to do that, but it's really important, take an inventory of all the species that are there and just keep lists of that stuff and see how it's working. Maybe your type of control isn't being effective and you need to stop with that management tool and start something else so that you're not wasting your time and your money. So it's just really important to keep at it. Like whenever I treat or pull or any management I do, I try to map every single area so that way I can overlay the maps and see, is this shrinking, is it staying the same? So just keep on it, don't give up, be persistent. Okay, so here's some of my resources. Once again, I will send this out to you. There's a question. It isn't practical to bag trees or multiflora rows. How do you dispose of it? Oh, geez, I'm sorry. I forgot to go over that when we were talking about cut stump. So when you're cutting brush or you're cutting trees, anything that can't be pulled and bagged, what we do, or what I do personally, is make wildlife brush piles. And it's not always ideal because some of these plants will have seeds on them, and so you're still piling a potential seed bank. That's another point where you can use integrative pest management, and you can pile them. And as long as you know where the pile is and you can monitor it and keep an eye on it, if any new growth comes out of it, you can always use a very, small controlled application of chemical that will easily take care of it. It really shouldn't get out of control. But as long as you pile it where you know it is and you can keep an eye on it and that sort of thing, that is very helpful. If you can, get a burn permit, from your fire department, which isn't hard, you can also pile it and burn it. That's really effective. The only thing I'm going to say that you shouldn't do is wood chip it, because you could really, really spread that. And some people I know have wood chipped and then used as mulch, and then they just put invasive seeds into their garden or back on their property. So just be very mindful of that. Okay, I hope that answered your question. So here is a list of resources. Midwest Invasive Species Information Network is a humongous resource. If you want to go, there are tons of other species that I did not go over that you can find there. You can do training modules. You can refer to your Mid-Michigan SISMA, which covers 4 counties. Ingham, Clinton, Eaton, and Ionia, and Meridian Township is one of their partners. And so they're just great for resources, education. They do workshops. They're just a really incredible resource. And Ingham Conservation District is actually the funding for our Mid-Michigan SISMA, and they are the host site for that. So definitely support your local conservation districts, reach out to them. They're the ones that rent out injectors. This year, they might be getting a grant to have an invasive species strike team where they can start spreading out and helping to treat private properties. And they're trying to do it where there's not a cost, but even if there is, it's very minimal. And also you're giving money to a very important local environmental organization that's helping keep your local natural areas wonderful. So it's at least very well spent money. Play Clean Go is also a really great resource for recreational responsibility. They have a lot of really good education and some cool swag for all that stuff. And then if you want to get involved locally here in the township, we have our Meridian Conservation Corps, and we have an invasive species strike team within the Conservation Corps. And we just started it last year, and it's just growing every day. And our big mission is just to really connect you with those local organizations that are doing really good work, and then also to go out and do stewardship and invasive removal out in our parks and preserves. So we're just here to help us with invasive species, but also to help connect you to, organizations like the Red Cedar River cleanups and Friends of the Red Cedar. And we're doing a vernal pool patrol program this year. And there's just a lot of really amazing opportunities. And there's also amazing people. Here's that before and after picture. It doesn't, it's definitely not as stark as some of the really crazy, like big Phragmites treatments. But if you just look at that tree and how covered it was, and that honeysuckle was covering that entire hillside. And it looks like it can breathe again. So it's really, it really can make a huge difference. And you can see that we made those wildlife brush piles too. You can see one of our lovely volunteers standing next to one of them. Rabbits love it, salamanders, snakes, frogs use them. All kinds of animals will use those brush piles. So at least something good can come of it. That is really it. I really appreciate you all coming out, and this was my first webinar ever, and being able to have this opportunity is really amazing. And if you have people who want information, if you need more information, like I said, please just let me know. This is my job. This is what I love doing every day. If you need help in your yard, I've gone and pulled garlic mustard in a volunteer's yard before off work. You know, just let me know if you need help or guidance. And if you do send me pictures, send me lots of pictures and good pictures, so that I can really check stuff out and be able to hopefully identify things for you. So thank you so much. Look out for all of those resources. And I just really look forward to working in the community more and helping our invasive issue. All right, everyone have it. Wait, I want to make sure these aren't questions. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I'll stay on just for a minute in case people have questions, but thank you so much.
I'm going to stop your recording, Emma, unless you have anything else you want to get.
Nope, I'm good. I just wanted to make sure nobody had a last minute question. Cool. Oh.